Robert Kensington had spent years working as a deep-sea diver, mastering the art of moving through the ocean's depths with careful precision and unwavering focus. Known among his colleagues as one of the most methodical and composed divers, Robert was often the first to volunteer for the more challenging assignments. His calm demeanor had earned him the nickname the Ghost, a title that reflected both his ability to remain unshaken in life-threatening situations and the silent way he moved through the underwater world. On one seemingly ordinary afternoon, Robert completed a routine pipeline inspection 180 feet below the ocean surface. What was supposed to be another normal day turned into an experience that would change him forever. As he climbed out of the water, exhausted yet proud of his work, he noticed that his body felt tense in a way that was unfamiliar. His hands trembled, and a chill ran down his spine despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun. By the time he stepped on the platform, he knew that something had gone terribly wrong, something that went far beyond the usual dangers of the deep sea. Without hesitation, he walked into the main office and placed his resignation letter in front of Captain Reeves, the man who had managed the offshore operations for Poseidon Industries for over 2 decades. Reeves, a man who had seen divers quit after equipment failures, shark encounters, and other hazards, immediately sensed that this resignation was different. The look in Robert's eyes was unlike anything he had ever witnessed in 20 years of supervising deep-sea crews. It was fear, but it was also awe, confusion, and a kind of recognition of something so foreign and incomprehensible that it defied explanation. Water still dripped from Robert's wetsuit, pooling on the industrial carpet, his breathing coming in short, ragged bursts that fogged up the small office despite the ceiling fan working at full speed. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of what he had witnessed. Captain Reeves, though seasoned and practical, felt a wave of concern wash over him. He gestured to a chair with his boot and urged Robert to sit and explain. Robert's mind raced as he tried to organize the experience in words that would make sense to someone who hadn't been in the water, who hadn't felt the presence of something watching him from the darkness. He remembered the pipeline junction, the normal visibility of the water, the schools of amberjacks swimming past, and the curious groupers that approached him. Yet suddenly, all the life in the water seemed to vanish. Fish that were once abundant disappeared as if the ocean itself had paused, and Robert was left in an unsettling silence that was impossible to ignore. The feeling of being observed grew stronger with each passing second, yet nothing tangible appeared at first. Robert's heart raced. Not from exertion, but from a primal sense of awareness that told him he was being watched by something far beyond his understanding. He had trained for emergencies, known the risks of nitrogen narcosis, pressure fluctuations, and equipment failures, but none of his experience could prepare him for what he encountered. By the time he surfaced, he had come face to face with a phenomenon so bizarre and inexplicable that it forced him to leave the job he loved, abandoning the very ocean that had been his sanctuary for years. Captain Reeves listened intently, realizing that what Robert described was unlike any ordinary dive incident. The tension in the room was palpable, as a veteran supervisor tried to grasp the magnitude of what had shaken his best diver to his core. It was the beginning of a story that would not only affect Robert, but also hint at something ancient and mysterious lurking beneath the ocean surface, something that had been watching, learning, and perhaps even marking people long before humans arrived. That Robert's dive began like any other solo inspection, a familiar routine that required precision, attention to detail, and a calm mind. He had volunteered to go alone that day because his colleague Johnson had called in sick due to what he claimed was food poisoning. The pipeline junction at Sector 7 demanded urgent inspection, and corporate pressures left no room for delay. Robert had completed solo dives many times before, finding a strange comfort in the silence beneath the surface, away from the chatter of radios and the occasional stress of teamwork. That morning, as he suited up and descended into the deep blue, he felt the usual anticipation, a quiet focus that allowed him to monitor every movement, every hand signal, and every gauge. The sun filtered through the water, illuminating the ocean in a golden hue that penetrated deeper than expected, revealing schools of amberjack and curious groupers that swam around him, observing his careful movements. The pipeline junction was intact, without cracks or corrosion, and pressure readings were normal. Robert documented every step with his camera and slate, completing the task he had performed countless times with the efficiency of someone who had dedicated years of his life to this work. But it was after this routine inspection that the situation changed. Robert noticed the silence first, the unnatural absence of the small life forms that usually filled the water. Fish that had been abundant moments earlier were gone, and the quiet was so absolute that it seemed to press against him from all sides. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, yet his training told him to remain methodical, to complete the checklist, and then ascend. He had been diving for 8 years and had experienced the occasional oddity, but nothing like this. The stillness felt intentional, almost purposeful, as if the ocean itself had shifted to conceal something. Robert checked his depth gauge and air supply, confirming that both were within safe limits. His mind, usually analytical and steady, began to feel the weight of something incomprehensible pressing against his awareness. Then he saw the light. It was not bioluminescence from plankton or jellyfish, familiar to anyone who had spent time in the deep. This was different. A soft, pulsing glow emanated from below, moving with a rhythm that suggested consciousness. Its color was a shifting blue-green, unlike anything Robert had encountered. He realized that it was rising toward him, moving with purpose, yet with a stillness that defied natural movement. Robert attempted to maintain a controlled descent, remembering his training for buoyancy and decompression stops, but his eyes remained fixed on a glow that now seemed almost alive. As it approached, he could make out shapes that defied conventional understanding, appendages that shifted without following the natural motions of known marine life, angles that seemed geometric and impossible, a form that was both physical and abstract at the same time. His heart pounded, and every instinct told him to flee, yet a part of him wanted to understand, to reach out and interact. The creature's presence was hypnotic, drawing him in with a silent force that seemed to communicate without sound, using light, movement, and perhaps intention. At 90 feet, his first decompression stop, the entity paused as if respecting the safety rules he had learned for human physiology. Robert realized, with a growing sense of awe and terror, that it had been observing him and possibly others for weeks. Memories of dreams and fleeting glimpses during previous dives flooded back, moments he had dismissed as stress or fatigue. The realization that this presence had been marking him, tracking him, and perhaps learning from him brought a cold dread he had never experienced before. Every instinct of a trained diver told him to escape. Yet the creature's behavior, silent and deliberate, suggested an intelligence far beyond anything he could comprehend. This was no ordinary marine life. This was something entirely unknown, something ancient and deliberate, a being that had chosen to reveal itself to him for reasons Robert could barely begin to imagine. By the time he reached 60 feet, his second decompression stop, the entity remained close, almost within reach, shimmering and shifting in ways that made his eyes ache from trying to process the impossible patterns of movement. It was then that Robert understood he could not continue in this job, could not return to depths where something ancient, intelligent, and possibly predatory had taken notice of him. He knew that his life, and perhaps the lives of others, had become intertwined with force far greater than humanity's understanding, and that this encounter would haunt him forever. When Robert finally broke the surface and climbed onto the offshore platform, the sensation of relief was immediate yet fleeting. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting the water in shades of gold, crimson, and eventually deepening into black of night. On the surface, the ocean looked calm, serene even, but Robert knew better. Beneath that placid exterior, the unknown watched, waiting, and had already marked him. His wet suit dripped water onto the industrial flooring of the platform, forming small puddles that mirrored the tension building within him. He picked up his resignation letter from his pocket and stared at it, understanding for the first time that he could never return to the routine of diving, the comfort of familiar equipment, or even predictable dangers of marine life he had trained for. Something unprecedented and intelligent had emerged from the depths, and it had taken notice of him. As he walked into the main office, Captain Reeves noticed a change immediately. The experienced supervisor had seen divers return from extreme depths shaken, frightened, and in some cases traumatized, but Robert's demeanor was different. There was fear, yes, but it was a controlled terror, a recognition of something vast, alien, and deliberate. The captain gestured for him to sit, try and maintain his usual composure, but the weight of the moment pressed against the walls of the room. Robert's breathing was uneven, and his hands moved restlessly as he recalled the events of the dive. Reeves listened carefully as Robert described the strange silence that had enveloped the water, the sudden disappearance of familiar fish, and the unnerving awareness that something was observing him. He spoke of the light, the way it pulsed and moved with intelligence, and the impossible geometry of the creature that emerged from the darkness. Words like geometric, shimmering, and hypnotic barely scratched the surface of what he witnessed. He tried to convey the primal feeling of being prey, the sense of vulnerability that even his years of experience could not shield him from. As Robert recounted the details, Reeves' mind raced to find logical explanations. Equipment failure, nitrogen narcosis, hallucinations. These were all possibilities that he considered, and yet none of them seemed to fit. Robert had double-checked his equipment, monitored his air supply, and followed all the correct procedures. His mind was clear, his movements precise, and yet he had encountered something that defied the rules of biology, physics, and human understanding. The conversation turned to the disappearances of others, including Peters, who had gone on a solo inspection 3 days prior, and Johnson, who had called in sick that morning. Both were unaccounted for, their quarters empty, their dive gear missing. Reeves tried to rationalize the situation, considering that perhaps they had left the platform for personal reasons or had been called away without logging it. But deep down, he knew that the weight in his stomach was the same one that had gripped Robert, a sense of an unseen presence, marking and monitoring those who ventured into the deep. Robert described the flashes of images that the creature seemed to project, scenes of the pipeline, of the platform, and even of the people themselves, as if viewed from the entity's perspective. It was not communication in any language known to humanity, but an exchange of understanding, an awareness imposed upon him that left a lasting impression. The implications were staggering. The creature was not only intelligent but capable of tracking human behavior, choosing who to reveal itself to, and perhaps influencing their actions. Reeves, a man of logic and discipline, was confronted with the unthinkable. He had always known the ocean to be dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with unknowns, but nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for an entity capable of observing and interacting with humans in ways that seemed almost supernatural. As Robert finalized his resignation, both men understood that the familiar boundaries of the job, the ocean, and even the world above were no longer secure. The depths had claimed an intelligence far older and more sophisticated than any marine life cataloged or studied, and those who had encountered it were forever changed. It was a chilling reminder that, despite humanity's technological advancements, the ocean held secrets beyond comprehension, capable of challenging even the most experienced divers, and that some forces, once observed, could not be ignored or escaped. The most haunting aspect of Robert's encounter was not the sheer size or shape of the creature, nor the impossible geometry of its limbs and surface, but the feeling of being marked. From the moment he first sensed its presence, Robert knew that this was more than observation. It was interaction, deliberate and purposeful. The creature, whatever it was, had singled him out, watched him for weeks, and now, through flashes of images and impressions, communicated something primal and urgent. It was as if he had been chosen, or perhaps tested, by a force that transcended human comprehension. The notion of being marked weighed heavily on his mind as he recounted every detail to Captain Reeves. Unlike a simple threat or random encounter with dangerous marine life, this entity seemed to exert influence without moving aggressively, silently asserting its presence and intelligence. The flashes of imagery Robert experienced during the dive were difficult to explain. He saw the pipeline from angles no human could occupy, glimpsed the platform and its crew through perspective of the entity, and even recognized familiar faces in ways that felt personal and intimate. Each image conveyed a warning or message, though Robert could not fully interpret its meaning. It was an understanding beyond words, one that his mind registered with instinctive clarity, but that his conscious reasoning struggled to process. He had always trusted his senses, his training, and his knowledge of the ocean's unpredictability, yet this encounter bypassed all conventional logic. The sensation of being watched, the certainty that someone or something was following him, was unlike any stress or anxiety he had ever experienced. It was deep, overwhelming, and persistent, leaving him unable to shake the feeling even after surfacing. The psychological impact was immediate. Robert felt a strange pull toward the ocean, a magnetic attraction that was part curiosity, part compulsion, and part fear. He realized that this force could influence his thoughts, draw him closer, and perhaps even endanger him further if he returned. The decision to quit his job was not impulsive. It was a protective measure, a recognition that the risk of re-exposure was too great. Yet even as he left the platform, the sense of connection lingered, a tether invisible yet unbreakable, binding him to the entity he had witnessed. The fate of his colleagues added another layer of dread. Peters, who had gone on a solo inspection 3 days earlier, had returned changed, silent, and distant, and his absence now suggested a deeper involvement with the unknown. Johnson, who had called in sick, was also missing, raising questions that had no answers. Were they victims, willing participants, or had they encountered the entity in ways that left them permanently altered? The ambiguity was terrifying. Captain Reeves, trained to assess risks, follow procedures, and rationalize even the most bizarre incidents, found himself confronting a reality that defied logic. He realized that this encounter was not an isolated event, but part of a larger, more complex presence lurking in the deep, capable of influencing and observing human activity with precision. As Robert left the mainland, the platform no longer felt safe, the ocean no longer merely a workspace, and the boundaries between human understanding and the unknown blurred. Every shadow, every ripple on the water's surface, carried with it the weight of possibility, the knowledge that something beyond comprehension was always watching. The very act of seeing the creature had connected Robert to it, marking him in a way that could never be undone. He understood that running away might provide temporary safety, but the knowledge of what he had witnessed, and the realization that the entity's gaze followed him even out of the water, created a psychological link that was permanent. The fear, awe, and fascination intertwined into a complex web of emotion, leaving him on edge yet compelled to understand more, to reconcile the reality of what existed beneath the surface with the life he had known above it. This encounter was a stark reminder that the ocean is not just a habitat for known species, but a domain for entities that humans may never fully comprehend, forces that operate on scales and in dimensions beyond our perception, and that contact with such forces can leave indelible marks on those who witness them. Robert had glimpsed one such force, and the memory, the mark, and the knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life. The reality of Peters and Johnson's disappearance weighed heavily on both Robert and Captain Reeves. The absence of the two men was more than just a logistical problem or a staffing issue. It was a tangible sign that whatever lurked beneath the depths was real, intelligent, and capable of influencing human behavior. Reeves, a man of experience and logic, had always relied on procedure and evidence, yet the missing crew members defied every rational explanation. The platform, once a place of routine inspection schedules and safety checks, suddenly felt oppressive, small, and exposed. The radios crackled with tension as Reeves attempted to account for every person on the crew, only to find that 2 were untraceable. There was no note, no warning, no recorded communication that could explain their sudden absence. Garcia, the communications officer, confirmed that Johnson had called in sick early that morning, claiming illness, but he had not been seen in person. Peters, meanwhile, had returned from his solo dive days earlier looking pale, withdrawn, and strangely distant, almost as if the experience had left an invisible scar on him. Now, their quarters were empty, their dive gear gone, and the weight of uncertainty pressed down on the remaining crew. Robert tried to process the situation logically. He knew that fear could distort perception, yet he had seen what he had seen, and the evidence of the entity's presence was undeniable. The flashes of light